Oh, yeah?
We were in that room, and then her grandkids went to Stepping Stone.
Yeah.
With my kids.
Okay. Let me get this phone quiet.
So whenever you,
Are you ready?
unmute.
Okay, yeah, I'm ready.
All right.
3, 2, 1. All right, welcome everybody. My name is Monte Soukup. I'm the chair of the Affordable Housing Advisory Board, and this is the March 11th meeting of that board. We're going to take roll, establish a quorum, then we'll hear a little bit about the rules of engagement for the meeting for our online people and people in the room, and then we'll dive right into public comment and our agenda. So with that, I am going to call the roll
Coat. Let me get it out of here.
and establish a quorum.
Let's put off.
Okay, and I may mispronounce this.
And I'll be
Hee Sung Han? Not here. Absent. Okay, Phil Englehart? Karen Willie?
Here.
Oh, could barely hear you, Karen. Okay, Galal?
here.
Christina?
Here.
Nicholas?
Here.
Sarah?
Here.
Stacy?
Here.
Brenda?
Here.
Mark?
Here.
Thomas? Yep. Chris Berger? Chris, I think, is not well today. He said he couldn't make it. And Monte Soukup. So we have 11 members. That establishes a quorum. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Leah to kind of talk about the online participation and the rules for public comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everyone. I have a few housekeeping items for this hybrid meeting. This meeting is being recorded and broadcast on the city's YouTube channel and cable channel 25. Please remember to mute yourself during the meeting when you are not speaking. The chat function for this public meeting is disabled. All chats will go directly to me. Unless you are participating during the meeting, please turn your video off. This allows the active meeting participants to be seen on the screen. You will still be able to hear the meeting. When you are participating, please turn your video on. If you have any trouble, you can send me a chat. The city reserves the right to mute people or turn individual videos off to minimize distractions during the meeting. Now I'll make a few notes on public comment. When the chair calls for public comment, individuals attending in person should approach the podium to indicate they wish to speak. The podium can be raised and lowered, and we encourage you to use this feature to ensure your comments are heard. Individuals participating via Zoom should use the raise hand function to indicate they wish to speak. Please leave your virtual hand raised until you are called on. Individuals will be called on in the order they appear in the meeting host screen. Please state your name before speaking. All comments will be limited to 3 minutes. Thank you, and now I'll turn the meeting back over to Mr. Soukup.
Thank you, Leah. All right, with that, we will open up the floor for public comment. I see no one in the gallery here. Anyone online want to make public comment? If so, just raise your hand or make yourself known. Okay, seeing none. Are there anybody on the board want to make a comment and open? Okay. All right, then we will close public comment. The next item on the agenda is to approve the minutes from the February 12th meeting. So I would accept a motion to approve those in a second, if anybody is so inclined.
Nicholas Ward, I motion to approve the minutes.
Thank you.
Second.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. Is there any comment or questions on the minutes? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to call the roll and we will approve the minutes. Same order I read in the last time. So Phil?
Yeah.
Karen?
Yes.
Galal?
Yes.
Christina?
Approve.
Nicholas?
Approve.
Sarah?
Approve.
Stacy?
Approve.
Brenda?
Approve.
Mark?
Abstain.
Thomas?
Abstain.
Monte? Approve. Motion passes 9-4, 2 abstentions. Okay, so we will move to the next agenda item. That is receive the fair housing and universal design presentation from Evan Corey. You're going to have to help me with that. I am terrible at
Korynta.
Korynta. Okay, that's easier than it looks. And Daniel Brown from Independence Inc. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you guys to talk about accessibility and sustainable design.
Right. Let me share my screen here. Can everybody see my screen?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Evan Korynta, and I am the ADA Compliance Administrator for the City of Lawrence. And today we'll be discussing some fair housing requirements and some design elements, and we'll also be talking about universal design within housing and accessibility. With me today, I have Daniel Brown from Independence Inc., and he's going to kick us off this morning. And Daniel, you can go ahead and introduce yourself, and we can get ready to go.
Sure. Hi, my name is Daniel Brown. I'm the Core Services Manager here at Independence Incorporated, which is a resource center for folks with disabilities. Yeah, so I guess we'll...
Hold on just a second. Leah, can you turn the volume up at all? We're having a little trouble hearing up here. Okay. Thank you, guys. Sorry.
I'm trying to get a little louder, I guess. I'll scooch a little closer to the microphone. Okay. So next slide, please.
There you go. No?
No.
It's always a learning curve every day.
It's good until it's not.
That's right.
All right, did that work?
Yeah.
Works for... So today I'm going to be discussing federal laws that cover fair housing, specifically how those federal laws address physical accessibility of housing. So when you think of fair housing laws, probably the Fair Housing Act is fine. The Fair Housing Act covers the vast majority of housing, whether public or private. So that's going to be the housing law that I'm going to be specifically focusing on more today. But there are 3 other federal laws that can apply to housing depending on the situation. So there's the Architectural Barriers Act. And this is an extreme simplification, but typically the Architectural Barriers Act would apply to housing that was constructed using federal funding. There's Section 504 of the Rehab Act, which could apply to housing that is in a program receiving federal funding. And then there's the American with Disabilities Act. And this is a common misconception. A lot of folks believe that the ADA covers private housing. It typically does not. The only time the ADA covers housing is typically if there is housing being provided by a state or a local governmental entity. It would also cover any part of the housing that's open to the public. That's typically going to be, say, like a leasing office. So a leasing office may be required to meet the ADA accessibility standards, but those standards just apply to the part of the housing, the public. It doesn't accept the actual private funding business. So important to know. Next slide, please. So as I said, focusing primarily on the Fair Housing Act, a little bit of background. Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, prohibits discrimination in housing. It's been amended over the years. It was amended in 88 to include protections for folks with disabilities. Fair Housing Act gives people with disabilities the right to request reasonable accommodation and modifications in rental units. So an example of a reasonable accommodation of a rental unit would be, for instance, somebody asking for an exception to a no pet policy to have the service animal in their pet, or requesting the waiver of pet fees, pet deposit, things like that. An example of a common reasonable modification request would be a tenant requesting the ability to install ground water. Then the Fair Housing Act also makes it discriminatory for covered housing to not meet certain accessibility by construction standards. So what are those specifications? Next slide, please. So there are 7 design and construction requirements that are required in the Fair Housing Act. So the first one, accessible building entrance on an accessible route. So essentially that means there needs to be an accessible route from parking or from where public transportation would drop folks off to the actual building where they need to be. There needs to be accessible use of public areas. So any amenities being provided by the housing, for instance, laundry facilities, a pool, workout facilities, things like that, would need to be on an accessible route from the building. And usable doors. So those would be doors that are wide enough to allow passage of somebody who's in there. Accessible routes into and through the covered units. So the ability to get through most of the units, at least the main areas, should have an accessible route provided. Light switches, electrical outlets, thermostats, environmental controls, and accessible location. So you don't want light switches too high that can't be accessed from the seated position that you see from the next area. You also don't want electrical outlets too low. Also, they need to be accessible from the seated position as well. Reinforced walls in bathrooms for later installation of grab bars is a requirement. That speaks for itself. Typically, that reinforcement is going to be around the shower. There would also be around the refrigerator for that. And then there's usable kitchens and bathrooms. So you'll note it says usable, not accessible. A usable kitchen or bathroom is a bathroom that theoretically, if you're using a mobility device, you could enter and exit. It would also theoretically, you could get up to an appliance, you could get up to a sink, you could get up to a toilet or a shower. It doesn't necessarily mean that that shower is accessible. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's permanently that you can come in the bathroom or kitchen. It also means that there's not necessarily making it well done. So an important distinction. Next slide, please. So there are 7 designs and construction requirements. How do you know if you're meeting those requirements? And the answer to that question gets complicated. So some of those other laws that we looked at earlier, Architectural Barriers Act and Open Facilities Act, have established standards that you can refer to that will tell you exactly what you need to do to meet those accessibility standards for that law. Fair Housing Act doesn't have such one uniform standard that you can go to. So instead, you have these safe harbors. So there are 15 of these. And if you pick one of these safe harbors and you follow every provision of the set guideline or the code listed here, then you will have been deemed to have legally met your responsibility under the law for the design construction requirement. It's also important to note the law doesn't require you to use safe harbor, but it's probably a suggestion to do that. But you are, no matter what, required to be able to step under it. Next slide, please. So we have the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act has design and construction requirements requiring accessibility of housing. Why do we have housing that is accessible to everybody? So first, let's talk about some of the limitations of the Fair Housing Act itself. So one, the Fair Housing Act doesn't, all housing that falls under the Fair Housing Act doesn't necessarily fall under those design and construction requirements. So there is housing covered by the Act that doesn't have to meet those requirements. And so to meet the requirements, the unit needs to be, the dwelling needs to have 4 or more units, and it needs to be constructed, designed and constructed for initial occupancy after March of 91. So immediately that excludes older units. So housing that was constructed prior to 91 doesn't have to meet those design and construction requirements. also needs to be 4 or more units. So that immediately excludes duplexes, triplexes, detached single-family houses. Also, multi-story townhomes are excluded from the design and construction requirements as well. Also, in buildings, even if it has 4 or more units, it's only the ground floor units that are required to meet those design and construction requirements. So if you're dealing with a building that has multiple levels, it's only the ground floor units that have to meet those requirements unless the building has an elevator. And I will tell you from my personal experience that the majority of apartments and houses here in Lawrence do not have elevators. Some do, but the Act does not require any minimum number of accessible dwelling units. So some of those other laws do. Some of those other laws would require, if you were using federal funding to construct housing, that you might be required to have a certain percentage from the accessible to folks with disabilities. The Fair Housing Act does not have any such requirements. The Act also doesn't obligate a landlord to provide or finance any needed legal modification requested by a tenant. This is particularly problematic for folks that are living in some of that housing that's prior to 901. If you're a person with a disability living in older housing and you need those modifications, the landlord has no legal obligation to bring the housing up to those standards. You as a tenant could, you have the legal right to request the modification at your expense. To do that. There's also a lot of housing, particularly rental housing, that's excluded. Folks bringing duplexes, triplexes, or renting single-family houses may also raise that as well. And again, in those situations, we land with the legal obligation to make that more accessible. Next slide.
Daniel?
So, yes.
I apologize. This is Leah Rosen, Affordable Housing Administrator. I just wanted to take a pause, and we're having a little bit of a hard time hearing you. And so I just wanted to do a quick check with AHAB members to see if it's coming through, if there are any questions so far, since the sound is, it's just sounding really muffled.
Okay.
We good?
I'm wondering if I'm speaking into the right
If
microphone.
we talk slower.
Where's his office?
Okay. This is Leah Roseland. The volume's up all the way here.
He's not a
Perhaps if you talk slower,
Sure.
if possible. Thank you. I'm sorry, Daniel. Thank you.
No, it's okay.
It's like
I'm looking to see if I can switch microphones. I switched microphones. Did that help?
Immensely. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. So I was covering limitations of the Fair Housing Act itself. So now I'm going to discuss some of the limitations of the design and construction requirements. So you have housing that falls under the Fair Housing Act and may also fall under those design and construction requirements. But there are folks with disabilities that can still live in that housing and still find it to be not accessible to them. So it's important to note that those design and construction requirements provide for an absolute minimal level of accessibility. Also, they don't require fully accessible units. So for instance, those requirements require there to be wall enforcement for the later installation of grab bars. They don't necessarily require the grab bars to be installed, nor, as we discussed earlier, is there a requirement for the landlord to come in after the fact and install those grab bars. There is no one uniform accessibility standard for compliance. So unlike some of the other laws, like for instance, the ADA, it's pretty easy to tell if somebody's meeting their accessibility requirements because you can pull up the standards and look. There is no set one standard for fair housing. So it's hard sometimes to tell if the housing is actually meeting their obligations, meeting those 7 design and construction requirements, because there's 15 harbors safe harbors you'd have to go look at. And they're not all the same. They don't all cover the exact same things. And again, those safe harbors are optional. They're not required. And then safe harbors don't address all the elements in a unit. For instance, washer dryers. Some of the safe harbors would require there to be an accessible space in front of a washer dryer. Some do not address that at all. As far as I know, none of the safe harbors require visual smoke alarms for somebody who's deaf or hard of hearing in a unit. faucet handles, like a lever handle would be more accessible. The safe harbors don't necessarily require there to be accessible lever handles on faucets or doors, things like that. Appliance knobs don't necessarily have to be within reach range on different types of appliances, and shower heads as well. They're not necessarily required to be accessible shower heads. And so what ultimately ends up happening is folks that are designing housing are typically designing for compliance with the law, not necessarily looking at like what would truly make this housing accessible. Like for instance, incorporating universal design and some of that design as well. So next slide, please. Okay. As you probably know, Independence Inc. has an accessible housing program. Because of that, we're contacted by a lot of folks who are living in housing that they're finding not to be accessible. We also do access surveys for the community. So we go out to people's homes and meet with them and problem solve accessibility issues that they're having in their home. And that's something I do a lot of. Because of that, I'm in a lot of housing around Lawrence. And these are some of the common housing accessibility issues that I'm running into quite frequently. And inaccessible entrances is probably the #1 call that I get for people wanting help problem solving how to make the entrance to their home to be accessible to them. Also run into a lot of inaccessible routes of travel throughout the home. So this is particularly true for single family homes and townhomes. See a lot of stairs, second stories, stairs down to the basement. But you also have stairs, it's not uncommon to see stairs in garages, or to see like a step down into like a family room or a den or something like that. It's also not uncommon to see sliding glass doors where they're going out to a patio, but sometimes you'll see them inside the house, going into like a sunroom or something like that. And those sliding glass doors have a track that goes along the ground that can present an accessibility issue for a lot of folks. Narrow doorways, particularly see that in older single-family homes, going to the bathroom. And thick carpeting is one I run into often, and it's not one that people think of very, very much, but thick carpeting makes it very, very difficult to self-propel yourself in a wheelchair. It's really hard to push yourself in a wheelchair when you've got really thick carpeting or a really thick carpet pad. Inaccessible bathrooms is probably the second most common reason I get called out to help problem solve, and it's usually looking at some type of inaccessible shower or shower head, grab bars, accessible high toilets, accessible sinks, so that'd be a sink that you could do a front approach to. And then just in general, inaccessible design of homes. I'm in a lot of homes and townhomes. I'm kind of surprised that have no bedroom or shower facilities of any kind on the main level. And that's particularly an issue for folks that are maybe have a temporary disability or trying to age in place and aren't able to do stairs anymore. Split levels, just inherently by design, are difficult to make accessible just because you have so many internal stairs. And then front porch configurations, depending on the type of configuration, it can be very difficult to add a ramp to a front porch. We run into this a lot with concrete slab front porches, where you have a concrete slab front porch, and then you've also got concrete steps going up to the concrete slab. And then sometimes there's even steps that then go from the concrete slab front porch up to the front door. It can be difficult to design ramps, and because it's concrete, it's not easy to move and modify. So thinking ahead for things like that, as far as designing for aging in place, could you install a ramp in the future if need be when designing the entrance front porch? And then just inadequate turn radiuses, we see this a lot in bathrooms. Bathrooms are small. It can be difficult if you're in a wheelchair to turn around in. It can also be difficult if you're using a bathroom and you need a care attendant in there with you. If there's not enough space, it can be hard for two people to be in there at the same time. So anyway, so those are some of the common accessibility issues that I encounter firsthand here in Lawrence. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Evan.
All right, thank you, Daniel. So, Daniel kind of talked a little bit about the fair housing requirements and kind of what is required, what's not required. So one of the things we're going to look at is kind of universal design and minimal accessibility standards just to make a unit as accessible as possible. And so when we're looking at universal design, it's really a concept or a philosophy. It has no set actual standards, but by looking at some of the minimal ADA standards, we can kind of apply universal design and universal concepts. So, the principles of universal design really have 7 in place. Equitable use, so the design of residential buildings that have accessibility for all. So example, no steps, no thresholds getting into the main entrance, flexible use so that it can be used by all individuals of the housing unit, whether it be somebody seated or in a standing position. So for instance, counter height, something like that, would be accessible for somebody in a chair versus, somebody standing. Intuitive use, so design that promotes simplicity. So for instance, one of the things that we'll look at is like rocker panel light switches instead of kind of the traditional light switch. It's just a little bit easier to use, particularly if somebody is using the light switch with a closed fist due to, hand limitations or dexterity issues. Perceptible information, so it simplifies tasks for users. So for instance, if you had a thermostat instead of kind of the old model where you're having to turn it or use kind of dexterity with your hands, would be something that's a visual thermostat or something that's easy to control, easy to see, high contrast colors, things like that. Tolerance for error, so making sure that, for example, we have an appliance such as a microwave kind of at counter height level, so somebody's not trying to kind of overextend themselves or overreach from a seated position and end up, spilling items from a microwave or something like that. Low physical effort, so universal design should promote design features which allow efficient and comfortable use for all users. So Daniel had mentioned kind of some of the lever-styled shower, bathroom, fixture handles, which is, again, easy to use with a closed fist. Size and space for approach and use, and this is probably the most common thing, especially when you're looking at a mobility user, is space within a unit. So areas that you can turn around in, whether that be the bathroom, the kitchen area, where you can kind of do a full 360 turnaround with whether it be a manual wheelchair or a power chair. So we're going to look at some of those design elements and kind of what we're talking about. So one of the things, obviously, whenever you look at any type of facility, whether it's housing or a city-owned facility, anything like that, one of the first things you always look at is kind of the parking approach and entrance into a facility. So some of the things you're looking at is making sure that you have accessible parking available. Some rental units have, assigned parking, and they make a reasonable accommodation for a tenant to later add access or a designated spot for access. But one of the things you'll always want to make sure is that you have an accessible route for an individual to transfer out of their vehicle and then get into kind of the front door of the entrance. So making sure that you have an accessible route from parking all the way to front entrance. And then one of the other kind of universal design is automated entrances. Now, automated entrances aren't a requirement of the ADA either. If you have an automated entrance, it has to meet ADA standards, but it's not a requirement to have an automated entrance, but obviously that adds greater accessibility for all. Minimal thresholds, as you can see, kind of the front entrance door there has a very low threshold, so somebody could easily cross that threshold with any type of mobility device. So some of the things when you're looking at accessible entrance features, so the minimum requirements for a door entrance or any door, whether it be exterior or interior, is 32 inches. But again, something a little bit bigger, larger, 36 would be preferred. This will help accommodate, some of your larger power chairs or mobility devices. It makes it a little bit easier to get through. Sometimes 32 with a larger mobility device like a power chair can be a pretty tight squeeze. Another one, again, door automation. If you have the ability to automate doors, that increases accessibility. Under 5 pounds opening force. Now, this is typically for interior doors. So you want to make sure that if you don't have an automated door that they're very easy to open and they have a self-closer where you don't have to worry about trying to find the lever and pulling it behind you to close, but it's a very light door. So typically that only applies to interior doors just because it's really hard to have a 5 pound or less exterior door just because of wind and things like that. So unless you have a really good closer, it's pretty light and can be kind of affected by the wind and things like that. So 5 pounds is actually more of an interior door. And then if you don't have an automated door, obviously we talked about the lever handle. So there's an image of a lever handle, which makes it easier for somebody to use with a closed fist, where they're not kind of having to grasp a knob and turn and use, a lot of dexterity with their hands. Some of the other key housing features, and some of them Daniel had kind of mentioned. So again, you have kind of the lever handle, throughout, whether this is kind of front door, bathroom door, bedroom door, just makes it a little bit easier to use. And again, the 36 versus the 32 door opening, again, just allows for a little bit greater access. 5 pounds opening force, interior doors, so kind of all the doors throughout your housing unit. Low threshold, again, you can see there's a transition piece in the upper right-hand corner that shows a very minimal threshold from one floor to the next, whether it be kind of entering the complex or kind of throughout the housing unit. Low pile carpet, and Daniel did mention this, and this is something that people don't think about very often. I'm a manual wheelchair user myself, and I can tell you that, if you have too thick of a pad underneath the carpet or too thick of carpet, it can really feel difficult to travel. It's almost like pushing on, really high, tall grass. So low barrier carpet, anything less than half an inch kind of in thickness, really helps when you're looking at interior units. And then again, we've done some examples there of that rocker light switch versus kind of the standard knob, and this is something that you can do with a closed fist as well. It makes it very easy to turn off and on. Outlets and light switches, basically kind of all throughout the complex, 15 to 48 inches, and this is the reach range for an individual who uses a mobility device. 15 is kind of as low as they want, an outlet or a switch, and then 48 would be, kind of the max, just when you're looking at reach range for somebody in a mobility device. So some of the kitchen elements that we're looking at, so minimum clearances, you can kind of see that top picture, the top left, that has 2 different styles of kitchens that you find pretty often in smaller apartment complexes. And both of those, you see there's a back wall. So you have a U-shaped kitchen. So if you have a U-shaped kitchen, 60 inches minimum is kind of the turn radius needed, because that way if somebody goes in, they can kind of turn their wheelchair around to get to other elements within that space. Or if you have a back wall and it's not a U-shape, it would still be the 60 inches because that has the built-in kind of turning radius for somebody using a mobility device. That top right picture, you can kind of see some of the clearance areas. So things to make more accessible, you see there's a clear space square under the countertop where somebody could go in and prep food, get things ready, or actually even use that stove to the left of that clear space. Clear space underneath the sink, which would allow you access to not only the sink, but also that dishwasher right next to it. And then you can see the circle diameter, which is the 60-inch turning radius within the kitchen, which is very important. Now, the bottom left, you can see some of these reach ranges. So these are the reach ranges if you're over an element. So for instance, you can see that bottom left, this gentleman is over a counter space. So if the counter space is 20 inches or less, you can still have your outlets or receptacles be 48 inches max. But if you have a longer counter space that is in between the 20 to 25 inch range, then your reach range goes a little bit lower because you have a larger countertop that you're trying to stretch over. So 44 inches would be the max there. The bottom right picture you can actually see is what's called a pass-through style kitchen. So there's not a wall on either side, so it maybe goes from one room to the other. So that would only be 40-inch minimum required because there's no turning space needed, because you could actually just simply continue on through the kitchen. So that would be considered like a pass-through style kitchen, which is also common in apartment complexes. So here are some of the shower requirements that we're looking at when we talk about ADA standards. So here you have, your typical roll-in shower compartment there on your left, which is 60 by 30 inches. You can see the handrails that are in the appropriate spaces. The shower elements, controls have all been placed kind of on that back wall near the fixed transfer seat. Now, when you're dealing with kind of older construction, a lot of these design features aren't going to meet the current standards. So a lot of times they're going to be retrofit. So you may not get the exact 60 by 30 or an alternate transfer type shower where you're talking about like 36 by 36 inches. So sometimes it's called maximum extent feasible. So when you look at a unit what can you do to make it the most accessible given kind of the current conditions that you have? And we run into this too a lot with even city-owned facilities. You know, a lot of times I'm going into, you know, whether it be our aquatic centers and bathrooms and restrooms and shower units, you know, some of those predated ADA. So we're looking at kind of how can we make this unit the most accessible given kind of some of the current restraints. So, you know, really when you're looking at a shower unit, what are the elements that are, you know, that would make those the most accessible? Obviously, grab bars, shower controls in the reach ranges, whether it be a fixed or foldable seat, or even a seat that you could put in there. So, you know, sometimes people have bathroom chairs that they just have that they, you know, you can buy them at any durable medical equipment store or Walmart, and you can actually take them in and out of a shower unit or a bathtub. On your right is some different shower styles. So you can see kind of one of the showers on the left there is a transfer type shower that actually has a folding seat. And then you have kind of on the very far right, you have a kind of a typical smaller 36 by 36 transfer shower that actually has the fixed seat, and it has some of the design elements in there that show, you know, grab bars are always 33 to 36 inches, seat heights, maximum for controls and things like that. So when you're looking at bathrooms, again, you know, one of the things that we're really focusing on is that turning radius and clear space around elements. So obviously for bathrooms, if you can get a 36-inch door, or the wider the better. Clear floor space, so you can see in the top picture, it's got actually a 60-inch diameter where even when the door is fully open, there's still that 60 inches to either access the toilet, the sink, or the bathtub or shower unit. The bottom picture, you can see different clear spaces as well. So you have your clear space to pull up and use the accessible shower around the toilet, and then you actually have clear space to roll under the sink compartment. So that's really important when you're looking at kind of bathrooms, making sure that you have kind of the appropriate space required. And that's one of the most difficult things is, you know, especially in housing and apartment units, you know, the kitchens tend to be pretty small, bathrooms tend to be pretty small. If you can get some of these kind of basic requirements in there, it really helps with accessibility, especially the clear space. There's nothing harder than going into a bathroom and just not having the appropriate space to even pull up to an element and use that, or close the door behind you because there's not enough room. It can make it very tricky. And one of the other features is these removable shower heads. So whether you have, you know, kind of a fixed, you know, on a fixed pole where you could have it at different heights, or somebody could actually grab kind of the removable shower head and use that kind of at their own discretion. When we're looking at some of the different things in accessible bathtubs, you know, you see bathtubs a lot in housing units as well. They probably don't have roll-in showers or things like that. But here are some of the different design standards that you could have for a bathroom. There on the left, you have a bathtub that has actually a folding seat, so you can use the seat, or you can actually get down into the tub. So you'll actually see that it has 2 bars. So the lower bar is when you're actually in the tub and want to, you know, kind of use that lower bar to help lower yourself into the bathtub, and a back bar as well when the seat is up. And then on the very right there, you'll see kind of some more technical guidelines that actually has the measurements that show kind of grab bar height. This one actually has a fixed seat in there as well. So you can see that it has the removable shower head as well. So if you can imagine, if you're sitting in that seat, you can still grab the removable shower head and use that. You know, you might not even get much of the water on you if you use that top shower head without that kind of bottom removable shower head. So just some things to think about when you're looking at kind of accessible bathtub units. Kind of some other important features, you know, whether you have you know, laundry in unit, or kind of, you know, maybe you have a common laundry unit. So you're always looking at kind of clear spaces. So you have clear space at the washing machine, at the dryer. And then you can actually see this gentleman on the right in this picture, the controls for the washer that are in reach range for him to use. Now, obviously, if you can do front-loading washing machines, if that's an option, those are obviously more accessible. The controls are kind of on the front of the machine. The doors open at the front of the machine. It's a little bit easier, a little bit more accessible. But here, those are some of the kind of reach range requirements. Some of the other common areas that I know Daniel mentioned that, you know, should be on accessible routes. Now, again, not all facilities will have these type of units. But some of the things that you'll want to make sure that are on accessible routes. So is there an accessible route from your unit to the lobby? So you can get in there and either talk to the manager of the property or kind of do activities or whatever, might present itself in the lobby. If you have a fitness facility, obviously there's some accessibility requirements to fitness facilities as well. Pools, it's probably a stretch, but there are a lot of smaller apartment complexes that have, shared pool units. Garbage, a lot of time, if this isn't in the actual unit, but they have maybe a common area where everybody has to go bring their trash to, is that on an accessible route? Is the garbage can accessible? Is it easy for somebody to get to and actually dump their garbage? And then, like I said, laundry facility, if you had kind of a common laundry facility, there are some accessible requirements that we'll want to look at for that as well. So kind of here are some examples of different kind of lobbies. Now, again, these are, a little bit more elaborate than most. I mean, some lobbies may just have, a desk in there or something like that. But when you're looking at kind of lobbies, we're looking at accessible portions of the counter so somebody in a mobility device can kind of sit and talk face to face with, property manager or who's ever kind of at the front desk area. So lowered portion, 36 high by 36 max wide. So again, somebody can kind of roll up and either get the services they need or talk to the individual behind the counter. Real quick, just on fitness facilities, if you happen to have a fitness facility, you can see that in that top right picture, you can actually see the accessible route throughout the fitness facility. So 36-inch wide kind of accessible route throughout the facility. And then you can see the clear space, those lined boxes that somebody could actually park their mobility device in and then transfer over to a machine or even just pull up directly to a machine and use those facilities. Pool, again, this is probably a stretch, and most most complexes, if they do have a pool, they're a very small pool, similar to that pool on your right. You'll see those this setup with this lift chair, very common in smaller apartment complexes, hotels, things like that. So you can actually see an accessible entrance into the pool. If you don't have a lift chair and it's under 300 linear feet, you could also have a sloped entrance as your accessible entrance to a pool, like you see on your left there. That's not very common. Typically, you see that sloped entrance when you're going to kind of a larger indoor or outdoor complex that may have kind of a sloped entrance in. Again, not very common. The most common thing that you'd see would be the accessible pool chair lift. We talked about some of the garbage and laundry facilities. So again, this is on an accessible route, and it's in an accessible area within reach range for an individual to put their trash into the receptacle. So again, on an accessible route at accessible height. The picture on the right, if you had kind of a laundry facility, the ADA standards don't require all machines to be accessible. However, one dryer and one washing machine are the minimum required. But if you happen to have a group, so if you have more than 3 washers or 3 dryers, then 2 must be accessible of each. So whether you have 3 or 50, at least 2 need to be accessible of each. So 2 washers, 2 dryers need to be accessible. So you can see kind of on the right there, they have some front loading machines, and as well on the left there, some of the bottom ones are front loading as well, and plenty of space within the complex to kind of turn around and some maneuvering clearances and turn spaces as well. So that's kind of really all that we have as far as some of the things we want to look at when we're talking about kind of accessible units and things we can do to make them a little bit more accessible. And again, these aren't all encompassing. I mean, as Daniel mentioned, there's a lot of different design standards when you're talking about fair housing that you may have applied towards your housing unit. And again, it's going to be a little bit different for everybody. Everybody's accessibility is different. But I think if you incorporate some of these minimum standards and kind of universal design standards, then you're really looking at an inclusive unit that could be used by everybody. So yeah, with that, if there's any questions from the group, Daniel or I would be happy to answer.
All right. Anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Hi, Phil Englehart. My question is, has there been any empirical information, data, if you will, collected to show what the difference in cost might be for a unit that incorporates the 60-inch turning radiuses in the bathroom and the kitchen versus a standard, quote unquote, apartment unit, of the same number of bedrooms and bathrooms and so forth? I mean, is there any like RS means data or other kind of data that shows what that additional cost might be, roughly? If that question even makes sense.
Yeah, Daniel, you do a little bit more with fair housing. Obviously, my role with the city is a little bit different since I handle kind of ADA requirements and city-owned facilities and services. So Daniel may have a little bit more experience directly working with different housing units.
I'm not aware of any data like that. I know some aspects of universal design, like lever handles and things like that, are pretty easy and cost-effective to implement. But yeah, modifying a bathroom or a kitchen to have that 60-inch turn radius would be, it would cost a lot more, certainly. But I've not seen any studies that have shown the cost difference.
Yeah, and I think one of the really hard things is, like Daniel had mentioned, there's a lot of different design standards that you could apply to fair housing, and all units are a little bit different. So if you're dealing with an older facility that you're trying to retrofit that didn't currently have kind of the space requirements and things like that, it can be really challenging. So when you're looking at those units, it's really about how can we make this accessible to the maximum extent feasible. So if we don't quite have the turning radius that we need in the bathroom, do we at least have, kind of bars or reinforced walls in place so somebody could either transfer to a toilet or a shower compartment or things like that. So a lot of this, especially when we're looking at older constructed facilities, it's really how can we make it as accessible as possible given some of the current restraints. Now, obviously, some of the newer built facilities will have, some of these standards and building codes already in place that will kind of allow for some of that access. And I think one of the important things is, especially when you're dealing with new construction, is that a lot of the technical requirements that we went over, those are the minimal standards. So that is the minimum you have to do when you're looking at new construction. I mean, you can always do more. You could do 36-inch doors versus 32, and obviously, there would be some cost differences to that. But it's much more cost effective when you're looking at including accessibility and universal design in new construction versus trying to have to retrofit it later, just because there just tends to be so much more involved when you're trying to retrofit something that wasn't made for accessibility into accessibility. But yeah, I don't know if there's any data that I've seen either that kind of compares some of those figures.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, for anybody that might know, Mark Bueller, I'm sorry. You give us a feel for how high this hill is to climb in terms of the standards that would be perfect today? Is 1% of the housing out there built to the standards we're talking about, or 10? How bad are we? Evan?
Yeah, I don't have that, just because my role doesn't really deal with like private development or private housing. So if new affordable complexes are being built, obviously they'd be built to the standards, but I don't know kind of what we currently have in inventory of affordable housing in town. Daniel, maybe you have some better idea of kind of roughly how many affordable units are kind of available in Lawrence, but I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard to say. There's certainly a lack of it because we frequently get people calling us requesting help finding accessible housing. So there's definitely still a need for it. I don't know if I could speak to like a specific percentage. When people call us, we typically advise try to look for housing that's newer, that's past the date that those design and construction standards went into place, because then your chances are higher that you're going to find housing that's accessible to you. And then also looking at those ground floor units, because even pretty large apartment complexes can have a ton of buildings, but it's only those ground floor units that have to meet those requirements. So
Right.
there might be a lot of units there, but only some of them are meeting that. So it might be a pretty small percentage. And again, the Fair Housing Act doesn't require any kind of percentage. So it's difficult to say because I've not been through all the units of different apartment complexes in town.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sure.
Go ahead,
This
Karen.
is, Jim, this is Leah Roseland, Affordable Housing Administrator. Karen, were you going to answer the question about access? Okay, Mr. Chair, can I just interject for a moment?
Sure.
Okay, so to provide a little bit more additional information to follow up on that question, one, that's one of the aspects that we will be digging into with the updated housing study, is to really get an understanding of how many accessible units there are, how many we need, and what we need to do to close that gap. The most recent data we have is from the 2018 Lawrence housing market analysis, and at that time it showed that there were 500 households with disabilities that needed accessibility modifications. So that was published in 2019. We know that the housing crisis has gotten worse since then, so I expect that that number is bigger at this time, although we have made some headway into accessible units. So I would say at a minimum 500 additional accessible units are needed.
Thank you.
Okay, Karen, why don't you jump in there?
Sure. I have a question for Evan, and it's about garbage. So in City of Lawrence, I know MSO also manages trash pickup. I serve on the board for some affordable housing in Baldwin City, and we've really struggled there to get trash containers that are accessible. They'll provide like one, depending on like ADA units, but all of our folks that live there need help with that. Like it's just too high. So does MSO, are they pretty responsive? Because a developer can't necessarily choose what kind of dumpster they're getting for an apartment complex. It's kind of on the city.
Yeah, I can look into that. I don't, there's a lot of requests that will come in, whether it be for like private housing. So we have special request forms where if, an individual who was in private housing that needed help getting their cart from, their front entrance to the curb or whatever, we have a program in place that kind of allows that accommodation where the garbage man will actually come and grab the cart and actually bring it to the truck and then bring it back. But I don't know about accessible units at complexes, but that's definitely something I can look into and see kind of how receptive they are, kind of how many we have in stock, what's the request. But I can definitely look into that.
That'd be great. And not necessarily based on specific ADA units, but just kind of part of that universal design. Can anyone who lives there likely access the trash facility? Yeah.
And that's one of the that's one of the benefits, when we're talking about universal design or accessibility kind of in general. And I know Daniel had mentioned this, this aging in place model, which is, there's a percentage of folks obviously that identify as a person with a disability. But there's a lot of folks that have mobility issues or have some type of issues, whether it be health or just aging, that don't necessarily consider themselves a person with a disability. But if you look at some of these universal design elements, it really incorporates, kind of people that are elderly or aging in place as well. So, that's definitely something that we can look into, kind of some of the trash and accessible around the trash.
Yeah. So I've got a question. The Monte Soukup. So, part of our role is to send out these notice for funding, and then we're asking for people to propose on projects. So, and don't expect you to answer this right now, but it'd be nice to have some kind of guideline for us to put in our notice of funding that would say, if you're building affordable units, X percentage, to meet our goals, X percentage should be universal design, or whatever the term of art we need to use to make sure that we're getting the units that are at least adaptable. It's hard to, like you say, it's hard to go into an existing bathroom and add square footage. But if we're just getting the square footage in the bathroom, it's easy to come in and add the grab bars and, whatever else. So what should we be asking for, and I'm looking for a recommendation on what the percentage, if they build 100 units, should 5% of them be accessible? Should 10%, 30%? What is it we need to meet our goals? So that's what I'd like to eventually get from you, the two of you, or whoever that is at the city, or.
Yeah, so I think, I think one of the things, specifically that Daniel mentioned, so if you're talking about kind of new construction or construction, new affordable housing, there'll be a set of standards in place that have to be met for kind of the Fair Housing Act and fair housing requirements as far as adaptable units. But like Daniel said, adaptable doesn't always mean accessible. So
Right.
they may have reinforced walls in the units. They may have some of those elements in place, but they don't have the grab bars or anything like that. And there's nothing that would require the landlord or builder to install them kind of at the time of construction. They could be on a case-by-case basis.
But we can require that. We can require that because we're providing funding in exchange for. So I think we could provide. So what I'm asking is, what do we want to ask for as opposed to what is the minimum requirement on our projects?
And how much more weight should the NOFO scoring matrix have to take into account the desire to incentivize this behavior?
Yeah, that's a question I think we got to answer,
Okay,
but but I agree. Yeah.
I think that there have been communities that have tried to implement some guidelines regarding universal design, so it might be good maybe for this group to take a look at some of those, and I'm happy to do some research and maybe get back to you on some of that information. As far as a specific percentage of units, maybe whatever study is being done can help inform that question. You could potentially look at some of the other laws that do require a certain percentage of units to meet accessibility guidelines. So you could look at some of those laws and see what percentages they're requesting. That might be something you all could incorporate.
Okay.
And I would recommend heavily weighting aspects of universal design in your grading rubric when looking at funding allocation. Certainly would be what I would advocate for.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's kind of the challenge when you're looking at universal design, just because it's more of a concept. It's not an actual regulated standard. So it's nothing that you can apply like the ADA standards. So I think that the ADA standards, are a very good, kind of threshold when you're looking at designing units, because then, you're at least meeting kind of the minimum requirements accessible. And kind of when I look at, universal design, I take into account kind of what are the basic requirements of the ADA, and then look at, okay, what if you did this? Does it make it even more inclusive? And typically, again, the ways that you're going to get around that is space and making sure that you have kind of turn radiuses and clearance around elements and things like that. That's really, and that's why in the older units that weren't built for that or don't have that size, that's, size and turning space and clearance space is really kind of the basis of all accessibility. If you don't have that in, whether it be a kitchen unit, a bathroom unit, bedroom unit, or doorways, things like that, it can really be challenging to make them accessible. So yeah, unfortunately, they're just, at this point, universal design is really more of a concept or philosophy than an enforceable standard anywhere. There have been some areas that have done really good work. I sent Daniel, a link a couple weeks ago about, it was kind of one of the first ones that ever applied universal design to all their units. And it was a place in California, I think, and it was a 55 and older, I believe, and they just did all their units, every one of them, kind of with universal design features in place. So, I mean, there are places that have done that, but again, it's not an enforceable standard at this point.
Right. Okay, Karen, I think you were trying to get my attention.
Yeah, I would say that something that we desperately need is some kind of a mini checklist of these are kind of the minimum things that would count as universal design, because we have it written in our NOFO that we're looking for that, but if it isn't a standard, we can't really do that. So, I mean, even if it's just 32-inch doors and a turning radius in the bathroom, like just to have, like that will get our attention. It shouldn't be like the massive list, because I think we're looking at kind of that maximum extent feasible, et cetera. But I think we could really use your help. Mr. Chair can say if that is true or not, to get us to just what that small checklist might be that we can use instead of the words universal design, if that's not something that's a standard we can hold them to.
This is Christina, Gentry. I think that there was also a mention of safe harbors, and there's 15 options and opportunities, so that we could maybe use that as a smaller guide if universal design is just too big of a concept for us to have people really assign themselves. I think that also, if I'm talking about being a builder and wanting to have these funds, and if you're making that to be a choice and you're foundational in your project, you're going to want to talk about that, and then you'll explain that as well. So having the safe harbors and those 15 options and opportunities could be something that we add and include to the addendum, as we talked about, maybe adding more information to the applications.
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah, I think there are some really good kind of small checklists that you could use. As Daniel had mentioned, there's kind of some 15 different ones you could choose from, or you could use kind of some of the ADA accessible standards. A lot of the safe harbor provisions that were listed in Daniel's thing, include the International Building Codes, which actually incorporates ADA standards. So even though there's a lot of them, they kind of incorporate the same minimum requirements, maximum requirements, and things like that for units. So I think you could definitely get a good kind of mini checklist when you're looking at kind of how do we want to construct or what do we want to look for.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else? All right. Thank you, Evan and Daniel. Appreciate the time to put this together and provide us the information. So certainly got some wheels turning. All right, we're going to move on to the next item. That would be receive the KOMA, KORA, and ethics policy presentation from Randy Larkin.
Good afternoon. I'm Randy Larkin, Deputy City Attorney, and we are going to go over KOMA, maybe a little conflicts of interest if we have time. I think Leah is going to run the PowerPoint for me, and this is very important stuff. It's kind of boring, so if you have anything or any questions as we go along, feel free to interrupt and ask questions, and the more interactive we can make this, the better. So anyway, this is about the Kansas Open Meetings Act. Now, the Kansas Open Meetings Act was enacted in 1972, and it was part of a wave of government reform that came out of the 1960s. And Kansas was kind of on the forefront of the Open Meetings Act. They were a little bit behind on open records, which did not come until 1984, but they were one of the first states. We were one of the first states to have Open Meetings Act. The purpose of it is kind of been described as the cornerstone of public access to local and state government. And really its fundamental purpose is to require local and state governments to conduct the business of the public in the public. The concept is that a representative government is dependent on an informed electorate. So that's why we have open meetings, and it's so that people can watch and see how government is done. It is an express violation of the Open Meetings Act to adjourn or to move a meeting to another place in order to subvert the purposes of the Open Meetings Act. And one other thing is that when the courts hear a KOMA case, they liberally construe its provisions and construe its exceptions narrowly in order to effectuate the public in policy. Now, KOMA applies when there are two criteria are met. First, the governmental body is a covered entity, and then whether there is a meeting as defined by KOMA. Under KOMA, the Affordable Housing Advisory Board is a covered entity. KOMA applies to all legislative and administrative bodies of the state and sub-agencies, including the city and the county, for example, and then any sub-agencies of the city from which we expend public funds to support, then they are covered entities. So that's pretty much cut and dry that AHAB is a covered entity. The more difficult question often in these cases is whether or not there's been a meeting. Now, under KOMA, a meeting is held when three things occur. Any gathering or assembly in person or through the use of a telephone or any interactive communications by a majority of the membership of AHAB for the purposes of discussing the business or the affairs of the body. So we'll just go through each of those three things separately. Any gathering or assembly in person, I mean, it's obviously currently you're having a meeting, so that's a gathering. Telephone calls, conference calls, online chat rooms, anything where you can have interactive communications between one or more members is a gathering, or it's called, it's an assembly. Now, a majority of the membership of AHAB is 7 members. There are currently 13 members on the Affordable Housing Board, and a majority of the membership of that body is 7. It's one more than 1/2 of the total. So 6.5 is half of 13, so it goes up to 7. So it has to include 7 people or 7 members of AHAB. And then the last one is sometimes the more difficult one, is whether or not it's the business or the affairs of AHAB. Now, KOMA is not triggered by a vote or any official action. It just has to be a discussion or some type of the business or the affairs of AHAB that would trigger KOMA. Individual members of the AHAB, even a majority, can gather and meet, social gatherings and things like that. You can go to conferences and other things, just as long as you do not discuss matters that are before the board or the affairs of the board. So if you have a vote coming up on, expending the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, or if you have a meeting coming up, you cannot discuss items that are going to come up before you. And we also recommend that you don't talk about things that may have happened in the recent past. I mean, once it gets beyond a certain time, it's a little bit stale. But those are the things that you need to avoid discussing when you are, in a gathering of more than 7 members or 7 or more members of AHAB. Another thing to be aware of is a serial meeting. Now, a serial meeting, so this is about electronic communications. A serial meeting is a meeting that occurs through interactive, and what happens, and there have been several cases of this throughout the state, it collectively involves a majority of the membership of the body. They share a common topic of discussion concerning the business or affairs of AHAB and are intended by any or all the participants to reach an agreement or a decision on something. And what happens is board member A will send an email or a text message to board member B, who sends that on to C, to D, and basically it's to avoid a situation where a board or a governmental body will be making decisions on a serial basis behind, closed doors, just so to speak. So anyway, just be aware of serial meetings. Also, when you have electronic communications among yourselves or from Leah or from anyone else from the city, avoid hitting reply all. It doesn't always cause a problem, but hitting reply all on electronic communications could sometimes cause a KOMA problem. Now, KOMA requires that public meetings be properly noticed. Since its purpose is to ensure that the public business is discussed in public, KOMA requires that they properly be noticed and then not be informal gatherings outside public view. That's why we have, Zoom meetings. They also have to be accessible to the public, so we hold them in places that the public can reach. And it is a duty of the presiding officer or the person in charge to provide adequate notice. Now, city will do that. I think Leah, as the liaison, handles all that. If an agenda is prepared, it shall be made available to anybody who requests it. Let's see, all votes have to be done in public. Secret votes are not permitted, and AHAB cannot prohibit the use of cameras or other recording devices, but can put reasonable restrictions on them so they're not interfering with the meeting. Now, agendas are not required by state law. However, if an agenda is prepared, it's got to be made available to those who request it. The board should follow the outline, but agendas can be amended, and they can be changed as necessary, and the chair can run through that as you go. Now, what happens if there is a violation of KOMA? The enforcement of KOMA, any person who is aggrieved by a decision of AHAB of open meetings violation is empowered to bring a private cause of action in district court against the city. The district attorney and attorney general are also given rights to bring actions to enforce KOMA. Remedies would include injunction, mandamus, civil penalties, and the payment of costs for bringing any action, and other appropriate orders, but do not permit damages. Damages cannot be recovered under KOMA. Now, if an action is brought to enforce KOMA under the state law, it will take precedence over other actions pending in court. So the judge will have to adjust his docket, and we'll hear those earlier in some cases. The burden of proof also is switched, just to let you know. In such cases, the burden will be on the city to establish that there has been no violation, as opposed to usually the plaintiff will have the burden of proof to establish that there was a violation. So if there is a violation, what are the penalties? Well, any action taken by KOMA, any action taken by AHAB can be void or voidable, can be erased. A civil penalty up to $500 for each violation may be assessed against individual members of the body. And I just should know that this is only for knowingly violating the provisions of KOMA. It doesn't have to have specific liability. A knowing violation occurs when there's a purposeful commission of the sort that it prohibits. So if you engage in a conversation and know that you're engaging in that conversation, that would be enough evidence. You don't have to have a specific intent to violate KOMA. The court may also enter injunctions, writs of mandamus, and can prohibit the city from taking further actions on the recommendations. And the cost of enforcement may also be assessed against the governmental body. But typically what happens in these cases, if there's a violation, which is what we try to avoid doing, is that you'll get your name in the newspaper, it will be embarrassing, and you'll have to go to classes to learn about AHAB. So that's pretty much practically what happens in these cases. But, in a bad situation, we can get into those other penalties. So that is KOMA. Any questions regarding anything?
You got a question?
Mr. Chairman.
Anybody have a question? Go ahead.
This might be related. I'm asking you if it is. Does ex parte comment come into this? Are we quasi-governmental? Is that what we are?
Sometimes you are, if you're, looking at facts and applying the law to make decisions. Typically your recommendations, as I understand it, you're probably not acting in quasi-judicial capacity, but to the extent that you make findings and have to make decisions based on those findings, then that is quasi-judicial. That would not, ex parte communications and quasi-judicial don't really fit under KOMA. That goes more toward conflict sometimes, or more towards just due process in general.
Would you explain, because I'll try to explain it, but you're the attorney, explain what ex parte comment is.
Yeah, sure. An ex parte communication is a communication from a third party that is made outside the confines of the meeting. So if somebody who's seeking funding, perhaps from the AHAB trust fund, meets with you or calls you on the telephone and says, hey, this is what we intend to do with the money, or this is what our plans are, that would be an ex parte communication. So it's a communication with a third party outside the confines of the meeting. Now, that does not apply to city staff. City staff cannot make ex parte communications with you. Communications between board members is also not ex parte.
So I asked you to define it because I assume people do talk to you about their projects, and it's not always right here. So I guess I brought it up because I want people to know they're not breaking the law by learning something about a project. Now, if you make a deal and, you understand.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's correct. It would be my recommendation, although I don't know that it's necessarily required because I don't know that you're actually sitting in a quasi-judicial capacity. where due process would kick in on that. You're making recommendations regarding the expenditure of funds, which is more of a legislative or administrative thing. You're not making recommendations regarding the rights of others and some privileges that may be taken away or other thing like that, which is what usually happens in a quasi-judicial situation. But at the same time, it would probably be a good idea, just for transparency's sake, and would be our recommendation to disclose ex parte communications, just so everybody knows, has the same information as they're making these important decisions to expend city funds.
Thank you very much.
All right, anybody else a question? All right. Is there another section of this, Randy, or?
Yeah, we can go on further
Okay,
and talk
I
about
think
conflicts of interest, which are conflicts of interest. Yep, we'll continue on. All right. This law dates to the late 1960s. It also came out of it, and really the purpose of the Kansas conflict of interest laws is to ensure that public office is not used for private gain. Under the Act, no board members may act on any matter wherein he or she would have a substantial interest. So basically, as appointed officials to AHAB, you're considered local government officers under the Act. Now, the Act does not require a board member to file a statement of substantial interest unless the board member is acting upon any matter which will affect any business in which the officer or the employee has a substantial interest. And basically, what is a substantial interest? There are 5 or 6 things I think they list. I think there's 6 of them. 5 things that the statute lists as substantial interest. If you or your spouse, either individually or collectively, has owned within the preceding 12 months a legal or equitable interest exceeding $5,000 or 5% of any business, which is less, or whichever is less, comes before you, then you have a substantial interest in that business. So I know this comes up quite a bit with the board here, because if you're, working for if you are a representative of somebody who's seeking funding and you work for them and are paid for them more than $5,000, or if you're an owner of that business within 5%, then you have a substantial interest in that business that's appearing before you. If you or your spouse has received during the preceding calendar year compensation, which is or will be exceeding like $2,000 from any business or combination of businesses, then you would have a substantial interest. If you're a real estate agent and you make a sale and you get commissions of more than $2,000 and you have to report that on your income tax, then you may have a substantial interest in that person appearing before you. If you or your spouse has, within the previous 12 months, received something of value of more than $500 from a business or combination of businesses, then you have a substantial interest in that business. You go to Dillon's and win a $500 shopping spree, you now have a substantial interest for the next year in Dillon's. If somebody gives you a gift at Christmas of $1,000 or whatever, you have a substantial interest in that person or that entity. The fourth one is if you or your spouse holds the position of an officer, director, or associate, other than tax-exempt corporations, not-for-profit corporations, then you have an interest in that. So if it's a Boys and Girls Club and you sit on the board, that's as a protected not-for-profit. You probably do not have a conflict, but if you sit on the board of another corporation or other business that comes before you that is not for profit or not protected by any of these other tax things, then you would have a substantial interest. And then finally, the last one is if you or your spouse receive commissions or fees of more than $2,000 in the previous years, then that would also cover. I think maybe I've combined the two with that. Yes. But anyway, that would be for commissions. This is more the real estate. The previous one was if you just got paid $2,000. Now, what happens if you have a substantial interest in anybody appearing before the board? You must either file a statement of substantial interest with the county election office of Douglas County, Kansas, or, as the more typical matter is, you just abstain. If you abstain from the matter, or file a statement of substantial interest, then you will not be in violation of the Kansas conflict laws or conflict of interest laws. And by abstaining, you need to step down from the dais and go in the back room while they take care of the actions. Now, what happens if there is a violation of this? If you take action on some item where you have substantial interest without either abstaining or without going in or without filing a statement of substantial interest with the county, these are a little more serious than KOMA, actually. If you violate it, it's a Class B misdemeanor. It's a crime. It will go on your record, and fines up to $1,000, and you can go to jail for up to 6 months if found guilty and convicted of this. So it's very, very important to if you have a question regarding whether there's a conflict of interest, to run it through Leah or run it through our office as well. If you're not comfortable doing that, there is a government ethics commission, and they will issue written opinions on requests if you think you have a conflict. And if they do provide you with an answer in a timely fashion and you act on it, then it's basically immunity. You will be presumed to have followed the law, even if later they determine that the ethics commission was wrong. That address, I think, was in the handout I gave you. And I think my my information is also there, but otherwise you can get it from Leah if you want to call me. So that's pretty much the conflict of interest laws. If you have substantial interest in anybody appearing before you, then you either have to have filed a statement of substantial interest or recuse yourself. And we typically advise people to recuse themselves just to avoid the appearance of any impropriety when we're dealing with your own employer or some business that you own. Are there any questions?
Any questions? Okay, I think not.
All right, well, that concludes what I have to present. So I think Leah set aside 20 minutes for me, so I think we got it.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you, Randy. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you. You guys have a
Thanks.
great day. Hey, and I also wanted to thank you for the service you provide the city. It's very important, and we appreciate all the work and everything that you do for us. So it's very valuable. So thank
Thanks.
you, everyone.
Thank you, Randy.
All right. We are on to item 3, and that is discuss the home applications and consider award recommendations. Leah, I think I'm going to turn that over to you or Danny or Brad.
Brad, yep.
Okay. Brad, I should have looked up. I would have seen you at the podium.
Monte, real quick, should we make recusals beforehand for folks?
Yeah, if we have anyone that needs to recuse themselves, now would be the appropriate moment.
All right, Nicholas from Tenants Homeowners, I do.
Well, obeyed Housing Authority.
Thank you, guys.
Yep.
All right, so today's item is a review of the Home Investment Partnership Programs. I'm sorry, I need to introduce myself.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Mr. Chair, maybe you or maybe Randy that we just lost could offer a clarification. Since the county helps to fund Lawrence Douglas County Housing Authority, do I need to recuse myself from the conversation? I'm happy either way.
Too bad Randy's not still here.
Yeah, we need Randy.
I didn't that far ahead, I'm sorry.
I don't recall the county representative ever recusing
No,
themselves
they never-
before
During our time.
during this time. So,
Yeah, I don't know under what Randy went through if you would have a substantial interest on any of those items that he mentioned.
she's
You're not.
compensated by the county.
She's not benefiting from like the housing authority. though.
No, I don't.
The county ARPA funds were what was given to Lawrence Douglas County Housing Authority
Right.
in addition to from our annual budget.
It doesn't feel like it to me, but I'm not.
Yeah, I don't think so. We've never done it before. So I think you can stay on, and if not, we'll fine you $1,000 and send you to jail for 6 months, but whatever.
Mr. Chairman, that raises a question for me. Family Promise does receive some funds from the Housing Authority for vouchers that we
You do, but that's not part of the conversation we're having today.
This is us to them, not them to you.
Gotcha.
You.
Thank
Yeah.
You're good.
I think we're good there. Okay.
All right, so I'll go on. Sorry, I'm going to back up. I didn't introduce myself. I'm Brad Carr. I'm the Community Development Analyst in the Planning and Development Services Office. And so we are here today to review and make recommendations to the City Commission for the Home Investment Partnerships Program. And I'm just going to give you a quick background on what that is. We'll shorten that just to HOME, so we don't have to state that every time. But HOME is from HUD, and it provides formula grants to eligible state and local governments to strengthen public-private partnerships and to expand our supply of decent, safe, sanitary, and affordable housing, specifically for low and very low-income families. And so under the home regulations, there are certain eligible activities, and that would be acquisition of housing, and that includes direct assistance to home buyers under down payment assistance. It also eligible is new construction, reconstruction, rehabilitation, and these are all of non-luxury housing, it has to be, with suitable amenities, and also to provide payment of operating expenses for what's termed as a community housing development organization, which we'll shorten that down to CHODO, and also to tenant-based rental assistance, which is a voucher program. Kind of our timeline of the home program is HUD requires every year that we provide an annual action plan to them and to our community on how we're proposing to spend our next year's grant funds. And so this is a part of that process. The recommendations that you'll make today will go to the City Commission in April, and then that will start a 30-day public comment period where the public can review the plan that we're going to propose to HUD and make comments, and then we'll go back to the City Commission in May for the final acceptance. Then our plan will be forwarded to HUD in June. And then if approved, our grant year would begin August 1st. So our 2024 grant year, which is what we're reviewing here, does not start until August 1st of 2024. So part of that timeline is obviously the review and recommendations that you'll make. And since you're our advisory board for affordable housing, that's why you're reviewing these affordable housing activities. We're going to go through some of the estimated dollars that we have available. And so we are talking in estimated dollars at this point. The federal government has not approved an appropriations bill for this year. And so we're still working under a continuing resolution, which means these dollars are, as I said, estimated. When we receive a final amount, we'll have to adjust these up or down depending on the amount. Just for an example, last year we estimated that we would receive $500,000 in home funds, and we ended up getting a little over $503,000. And so we took that percentage extra that we had received and split it across all of the applicants equitably on that same percentage. So we'll do the same thing again this year. So we're estimating once again that we would receive $500,000. We also estimating that we'll have $300,000 in what's termed as program income. And so throughout the past years, clear back to 1994 when the city first started getting home funds, there are certain different programs that the city ran at that time that put mortgages on people's property when they received home funds. And some of those mortgages are still out there and outstanding. And when that homeowner sells their property, they're required to pay a certain amount of that money back to the city. And that money is what is termed as program income. And we get to add that back into our pool of grant funds and redistribute it. So the 500 base grant that we're estimating plus the 30,000 would be 530. Out of that, 50,000 is removed for the city's administration of the program. And so that leaves a grand total of 480,000 that we're estimating will be available to award to these applications. As you can see here on this spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet we can use to type in recommendations as board members make them, and we can see how we have to up or down some of these until we get to that $480,000. You can see that we received 3 applications this year from 2 different entities, totaling a request of $636,500. But once again, we only have an estimate of $480,000 to award. Part of that we'll have to keep in mind is there are some regulatory minimum and maximums that will have to stay in. And those are specifically for back to that acronym, our CHODO. So the Community Housing Development Organization. And we do have one of those in Lawrence currently, and that's tenants to homeowners. And so under the regulations, we're allowed to award up to a maximum of 5% of our base grant, which is that $500,000 we're estimating, for what's termed as CHODO operating funds. And those are funds that the CHODO can use for their daily operational expenses, rent, utilities, salaries. That is totally optional. It's not required at any point. If you do decide that, once again, it is up to that maximum cap. So if 5% cap of our $500,000, the maximum would be $25,000 that you could award. You can see that tenants to homeowners did request $50,000. Unfortunately, we don't have that kind of money to award, and so that $25,000 would be the cap that you would be allowed. The other is a minimum, and that's also applies to the CHODO, and that's for their project funds, also termed as set-aside funds. And so for being a CHODO, they're automatically awarded 15% of the grant, base grant amount. So of our estimated $500,000, that would be a minimum of $75,000 we're required to allocate to them. In that case, you're allowed to award more, but at least that $75,000 level. And then the third application we received was for the Housing Authority, and that's for that tenant-based rental assistance, which is another eligible activity under the home funds. And that's a voucher program specifically for to move people from homeless into transitional housing. It's a 24-month voucher program where they also receive case management assistance along with their voucher each month. So basically, I'll kind of leave it up to you to discuss amongst yourselves and answer any questions. We do have, I don't know if Rebecca was able to join online in case there was any questions since Nicholas can't, or if anybody if Shannon from the Housing Authority.
Doesn't look like it.
Mr. Chairman, I have a,
Yeah, go ahead.
while we're working on that, is this a use it or lose it funding?
As far as at the city level or for the agency if we award them?
The city level.
Yes, definitely. There are, pre-COVID, there were regulatory that we had to award the funds to an agency within 2 years and have it spent within upwards to the maximum federal limit of 9 years. And so during COVID, they waived that 2-year. So yes, we're awarded the funds. Yes, they want us to see them spent as fast as possible. But right now, we're not required to award them within that 2 years. We can go out up to the maximum federal of 7 to 9 years.
Is this a relative of the old Community Development Block Grant Board monies?
It is a block grant under the federal government from HUD. It is a separate grant. The city does also receive the Community Development Block Grant.
Well, that's still
CDBG.
functioning.
It is.
Okay.
We still receive that. That's reviewed outside of it's not as an affordable housing activity.
I got
so
it.
That's reviewed by city staff.
Okay.
Makes the recommendation to the city commission.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Monte, Soukup, I'm going to make
Sure.
I'm going to suggest we put in the minimum on item 2B, put in the cap,
The maximum.
the maximum, and then put in the minimum on 2A. At least that leaves us with what we have to work with.
There you go.
So the $75,000 minimum for the project funds and $25,000 maximum for the operating funds would leave. That's totals to $100,000, obviously, and that would leave $380,000 to award for the other activities.
That's good to me.
Bill Englehart, three general questions. First one is, when and how does where can the public see the recommendations that are made?
So a part of that annual action plan that we have to provide to HUD is that we have to present it to the community. And so in April, we'll be going to the City Commission with our plan. It's usually about a 75 to 100 page document that goes over what our current conditions are in the city, our needs, a needs assessment, and then the outlined plan, dollar for dollar, and what we were going to spend our money on. So that would be released at that, I believe it's April 5th City Commission meeting? Oh, 16th, April 16th City Commission.
So that's where the public can, and again, that's where they make the comments.
Yeah, so then, and then that starts their 30-day comment period. They have 30 days to comment, and then we go back to the City Commission for final approval.
So, but the public's venue for making these comments is the city commission meetings. That's the avenue by which through which they would make any comments they might desire.
Or here, if they would like to, yes, either one. So they'll have two opportunities at the City Commission level. That first public meeting where we present the final recommendation again in May.
We also do take written public comment.
Okay.
So if they aren't able to make it to the meeting.
Okay.
Second question, just to satisfy my curiosity. When did the city get away from being in the income subsidized home mortgage business?
As far as like a home buyer activity, that.
Yeah, you said you were getting $30K from outstanding home mortgages.
Oh, okay, yeah. So the last of those would have been probably the Hand Network. I don't know if you were around since then.
Wasn't. That's why I'm asking.
Which would have been in the early 90s. It's at just off of Haskell and
25th Street.
25th, basically. Home Circle, I think is the actual street.
East of that.
Yeah. So there was a development of homes that it was a partnership between the Home Builders Association, the Board of Realtors, I believe, the city, and some developers. And they built 20 odd homes, I think.
If I'm not mistaken, tenants to homeowners for many years would give a silent second mortgage for 20% of the purchase price of a house, which was paid back over a 7-year period. 50% of it was paid back. That's another mortgage, a silent mortgage that refunds that. So that went on at least through, I think I was chair of tenants to homeowners through 2009 maybe. So it has extended far beyond that 92. So those people, probably there are some who held that original mortgage. It doesn't pay back until it gets transferred, until they sell the property. In other words, you buy a house from tenants to home with tenants to homeowners with that silent second mortgage, and for a period of 7 years, it gets incrementally forgiven up to 50%.
Okay.
The 50% remains until you sell the property.
Okay.
Now, 20 years later, you sell it, that 50% goes back to.
Out of the equity.
And that equity goes back to the city. That's part of what's funding that $30,000. Probably by now, if they are no longer doing it, much of that has been expended.
Yes, and so that original Hand Network was predated Tenants to Homeowners Community Land Trust.
Yep.
Okay.
And so those houses are outside of the land trust. They're able to be sold on the open market at any time. When Tenants to Homeowners created the land trust, yes, that's those silent seconds, but since they were in the land trust, a lot of times when those families would go to sell, the city would choose to either waive that balance or apply that 50% that's left to the next home buyer to bride the house down so that they can afford it.
And I'm sorry, Brad, I'm going to contest that just a little bit because the land trust did not come into existence until 2005, I believe. So there was a period between the Hand, which was in fact the genesis of tenants to homeowners. But there was a period between then and then the mid-2000s where they were not land trusted. They were instead just a silent second.
Yeah, and I believe all of those now are gone off of the books. We're not tracking any of those.
So really, you're talking about 3 programs.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to reel us back in here a little bit.
Did you ask all 3 questions?
I stop right now. I could talk all day.
I guess our ultimate goal here is to make a recommendation on these. So I don't know if anyone has.
Mr. Chair, I have a recommendation.
A recommendation, okay.
I would move that we grant the operating funds for tenants to homeowners, the $25,000 cap, that we then take the balance, which is $455,000, and we delegate $225,000 to the project funds for tenants to homeowners and $230,000 to the Lawrence Douglas County Housing Authority.
I was Before we make that recommendation, that's a really good one, a strong one, and I don't have any pushback on that. I wanted, if there was.
I'm sorry, Christina, I made a motion.
Oh,
and
okay.
so-
Well, now let's have a discussion
Yes,
first, Thomas. You did, no.
Yeah, the discussion happens once the motion is seconded, once you have a motion on the
Okay.
floor.
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah, I mean, it's Robert.
Okay.
Sorry.
Let's go ahead and go by
So
those
don't,
rules.
please, nobody second the motion just yet. So let's,
And you want to let it die, that's fine.
well, let's talk about it, and if then we have a second,
Yeah.
we'll have a second,
Right,
we'll move
let's
on.
Not go, move immediately to second.
Okay, then we don't have to go through a bunch of whole Robert's rules.
Fair enough.
Undo that. So let's have a discussion here. We got a suggestion on the,
I will withdraw my,
Thank you. And I'm not trying to be a jerk, but I just,
okay, so let's talk about this. Other people's thoughts. Open the floor.
So, okay, just checking to make sure I can ask questions and have a little bit of discussion. I don't know if there's someone from the Housing Authority available. I know we talked about maybe Shannon Oury being available online. If not, then this could be a question for later. But I went through and fully feel like, these are really great projects that recommendations for the 10 points was all, for me on my behalf, but I wanted to have some questions about the diversification of funding. And for the Housing Authority application in particular, there was 5% of grant funding for admin, but there was a 21,900 personnel ask on that application. I just wanted, that seems kind of low for personnel. I didn't know if that was for a 6 months period. You're paying for that for 12 months to ask. I just wanted to know how those diversification of funds being allocated for that small amount, or if HUD goes in and pays personnel, or the budget is in there for throughout the year. But how long do we expect that personnel funding to last? The frequency and duration of that personnel ask.
So as I read the proposal, that's a 2-year, so these funds cover a 2-year period for that set of families that get support for 2 years.
Okay.
That's the way I read it. I'm not with HUD, so take that with a grain of salt. But that's the way I read it. This is for this year's set of families that they will take through this 2-year process.
Yeah.
That's the way I.
Right. Part of the question asks us to give a number to a description if the requested funding is higher than 50% of the budget for personnel or admin, and we go accordingly. If it's 50 to 40 to 20% of the budget is for personnel or admin. Am I still in the space with everyone else? Because that was the 10 points that were allocated for each bulleted.
If we look at their proposed budget activity, I've got it brought up here, that 21,840 is other funds that's listed in a category. Those are not funded out of the home fund, so they're providing that out of their own money to administer that. Yes, they are asking for a 5% administration out of their ultimate award. Under the home regulations, they are allowed administrative costs to inspect the units that the people are living in and to income qualify the families on initial move-in and annually. Those are the only two things that they can use that 5% administration for. All other costs would be under that other fund category for personnel, and they have to come up with that money themselves. They're just showing kind of the cost match here on their application so that we can see what they're bringing to the table. And that does ultimately affect that scoring matrix on the percent of budget that is being spent home funds compared to their funds.
I was wanting clarity, so thank you for explaining. It doesn't sway my recommendation of being funded at 10%. As we talk about where the money's going, I just wanted to know how much, and it seemed like a low amount for me to consider $21,000 for our project director, operating specialist. These are positions that they're funding with this $21,000, but I just wanted to know where else they were getting the money for the 2 years. But that may just be in the HUD's, whatever they have for their retainment of staff. Yeah, thank you.
Other thoughts?
Well, I wanted to make some general comments on the North Michigan. I just didn't, and not that I need to really understand it, but I was having some trouble when I was looking at the proposal, understanding what the 286K ask was at 24% of the project budget. Was that 286K for the first phase of the North Michigan project? And does that represent?
The 3 houses?
Like 80,000.
Instead of 6?
Right, that was phase 1 was the 3. And I know that the covenant thing is out there and all that
Right.
business. I understand that there are issues there. But I was trying to get a feel. I mean, I reduce it all down ultimately to, what is it per copy? I mean, how much are we getting per copy? I have to think in simple terms. And if it's 3 units and it's 24% of the total project, okay, then that's very ambitious to get 6 units. If you're following my convoluted logic, such as it is, 24% is the ask is 24% of the total project, and that's 1.2 million to produce 6 units.
That's my math too.
Okay, but if it's 24% of phase 1, then we're talking about something approaching 350K or more per unit. And I know there's some residual land value and all like that, but there's a pretty big difference there. And I'm not questioning tenants or anything like that, but I'm just trying to understand what it is that we're doing here. Or I'll shut up, but it is a concern to me.
Yeah, this is really difficult without having the 2 representatives here.
Mr. Chairman, I was interested in, I was trying to figure out how much fun is that project? Meaning, how much money is it going to take to build those units? And there's some pretty serious numbers, but you're right. It's no time to start asking questions about archaeological costs, and so I guess,
Yeah.
I guess I won't. So
I broke this down differently. I looked, one, at the number of people we're serving.
Right.
Per dollar,
Okay.
and looked at that. And I also looked at, the TBRA has been an incredibly successful program. This body asked for that at one time, basically, asked our service providers to provide this transitional thing, and they've done that, and they've been very successful, like an 80-something% success rate of getting people virtually from near homeless or in the shelter to being stably housed and, with a Section 8 voucher. So to me, that's an important place. And I also look at it, and we've funded, we funded a lot to the, I always get the initials wrong.
Michigan City.
Gabby's, the one that Gabby and.
The housing stabilization.
Yeah, whatever that is.
Whatever that is, yeah.
The collective, we funded that pretty heavily.
That's true.
Over the years. But I would like to see a split that's a little heavily weighted. I'm not saying they should get 300, but a little more heavily weighted towards the TBRA program because of the success of it. The population that it serves, which is 30% and below, and the number of participants that we're actually impacting and families. I'm not saying others isn't important. These are all crummy decisions to have to make. But I just would see a little more weighted towards that one.
And this is the first application of tenants?
That TBRA, yeah.
Yeah. Well, in the past, they've asked and received, I have $400,000 AHAB is directly allocated, but they'll have 3 homes ready by 2025. I'm just reading.
I understand, but I think that you're talking about TBRA, which is the.
TBRA.
Which is Douglas County, that's the housing authority.
The housing authority.
And you're talking about tenant to homeowners.
Yes.
Okay, so you guys you're talking about 2 different things.
Correct.
Okay.
They are.
Well, I just asked if it was the first project.
No,
It's
Just getting clarification.
No, I was looking at the $300,000 request,
The Housing Authority.
The TBRA request.
Okay.
the TBRA.
Okay.
But
What were your initial recommendations again?
So,
This is Sarah Waters. I felt that the tenants, the Housing Authority's application, because it's serving 20 and they have a wait list of 37, so similar to Monty's point, was pretty important, especially right now. I also am just trying to understand tenants to homeowners request. I mean, it was about 85,000 per house. And I guess, like, that's what it said. For the 3 houses, that's what it said.
Yeah.
I also thought it was just interesting that they were even asking for money to build those houses. And when we already did some approval for
Bought
the
the land.
site. Yeah,
Paid
and I
for
know
the
it was
land.
the land, but, so I'm feel stronger about the Housing Authority's request here to get that fully funded, frankly. Because I just felt like it's really important that it goes, because of kind of the current state in the county.
I would agree with you. And I don't have to say what you just said. You said it very well. I would be bullish on the Housing Authority getting up to $300,000. We're all just doing math here, I think, at this point, right? There's some minimums and,
yeah, if you fully fund Housing Authority, TBRA, then tenants would have, we'd have 155 left for.
yeah.
Which is about
50,000 houses.
half of their request.
I did have a page and a half of questions about, and I wasn't here for the original funding of Michigan 6, so I'm not very smart. But that I had a bunch of questions about it. So anyway, that would be a motion I would support or second, to fully fund the Housing Authority, and the balance would go to tenants to homeowners.
Even though I cut Thomas off before, and I apologize for doing that, the notion,
No harm, no foul.
the notion of, I like to see units on the ground,
I know.
you know.
Me too.
I mean, I live in that neighborhood, and I like to see units on the ground, and so I'm more toward the 50-50 split myself. I mean, the needs are overwhelming everywhere we turn. I get that.
Yeah. My hope is that they have other sources to fill that up. And they listed several, and foundations and
Yeah,
so, and I feel like this body helped them get 400 to get going. That's a pretty good lick. That's a third of the cost of a $1.2 million project. So it may change their time frame, and I want people in the seats too. But anyway,
85, so.
Yeah, and without that, it's-
so is it time for motions and voting the stuff up or down? Sure. At the risk of, I make a motion, we fully fund the request from the Lawrence Housing Authority and provide the balance to tenants to homeowners. That's my motion.
All right.
Dying.
Do we have a second?
I'll second that.
Okay, any discussion? All right, this is going to be interesting.
Yeah. We'll be here for 3 hours.
Okay, we have a motion and a second, and there's no discussion. I'm going to call the roll, and we're going to vote on this as you see it on the screen there. So Phil Englehart,
Nay.
Karen Willie. Karen?
Yes.
Christina Gentry.
No.
Sarah Waters.
Yes.
Stacy Schroeder.
Yes.
Brenda Wall.
Yes.
Mark Bueller,
Yes.
Thomas Howe,
No.
Monte Soukup, yes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2. Motion passes 6-3.
Yep.
All right. There you have it.
All right, well.
You have what you need, Brad?
We do. Thank you very much.
Okay.
All right. Like I said, we'll be passing these recommendations along to the City Commission. Obviously, it is at their discretion to award the funds as they see fit. They will take your recommendations into account.
With a grand.
Those scoring matrix that we did supply to you, if you could get those to us, the City Commission does like to review those and see how each of you felt about the different projects in case they do want to make changes to your recommendations.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Thank you.
All right.
What if I didn't do my math right? No.
Okay, we're going to discuss the AHAB retreat. I'm going to turn that over to Leah, I think, because we are basically, well, I'll let you carry that in the next 5 minutes.
Okay, this is Leah Roslin, Affordable Housing Administrator. So a couple of notes about the retreat. At the last meeting, we discussed some potential dates and that I would send out a doodle poll to gauge availability of the board, which we did take the doodle poll, and there were no dates in which everybody was available. So that means that we would need to open up some additional dates and perhaps look at further down, further in spring or summer. However, I'm recommending that we pause scheduling the AHAB retreat. As we've discussed before, the City Commission is taking a universal look at restructuring all the city boards and commissions, and that work is happening right now. My understanding is in the next month or two that the final recommendations will come before the City Commission for approval, and that there will be some changes likely to the AHAB, although at this time we don't know the specifics of what those may be, but it could be membership changes and perhaps changes in the scope of the purpose of the AHAB. And so with those two factors, I would recommend that we pause scheduling the retreat until we know what those revisions will be, so that when we have the retreat, we can make sure that we are, one, doing so with members that will continue through the AHAB, and two, that we're focusing on the scope and purpose of the AHAB as it is revised. And that is, of course, up for AHAB discussion, and it's your decision either way.
Anybody have thoughts on that, comments? We okay postponing?
Sounds like a plan. We're going to wait.
Okay. All right. So without taking a vote by consensus, not seeing any objections, we're going to postpone scheduling that until we know a little bit more about where this board is going, as directed by the City Commission.
Our future's in the balance.
All right. Okay. We have a couple minutes for updates. So we have Land Development Code. Phil, if you want to talk, and then Christina, if you want to talk about Equity Workgroup.
I don't know if this is appropriate, given the KOMA and all that business, but I had written up some comments, and I gave them to Leah just today. And is it okay if you just send? Can you just send them out, and then, right? Then that way I won't have to belabor my stuff. So she'll send you the comments, and you take a look at them.
So obviously, when you reply to Leah.
Reply to Leah. Right? Yeah.
Not to the whole group, or you will be in violation of.
Oh yeah.
Or you could reply to Phil to ask him an individual question.
Yes, you could reply to Phil.
Yes.
Ask an individual
What
question.
clarification Phil could help directly.
Right.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Phil.
Yeah, okay. I'll just give a brief report. The Equity and Inclusion Restorative Housing Workgroup met. This is an extension or a subgroup of the Equity and Inclusion Workgroup. We met, and who heads up that? Well, Erica Zimmerman from Habitat for Humanity, thank you, heads that group, and along with others who are also in the equity inclusion group. The goal of this group is to, by 2026, identify policy and policy initiatives aimed at increasing home ownership, building intergenerational equity, and improving housing retention. It also has a goal of increasing accessibility and housing for persons with disabilities. So this evening's or this morning's presentation will fit in fine with some of that information that we need to continue that conversation. We also looked at integrating accessible designs and principles. So all of this is very timely information to have. So the discussion at that time was purpose-driven and data-driven. We are looking at collecting local data, including city plans from 1930 and 1948 from the city of Lawrence, looking at what has historically been planning and the city has made a focus on it and what those plans included, and doing just a real deep dive into that information, reviewing statements of the 1930 City of Lawrence plan, and also looking at to understand historical context as it relates to individuals who represent minoritized identities. We're going to continue to build research, providing evidence-based approaches to understanding and identifying potential effective solutions. Our next semi-quarterly meeting will be March 21st, is that correct? Or did I have something else written down? But we're doing a quarterly meeting. We understood, too, that a lot of the same folks are in that space, including folks that we heard it from today in Independence, Inc. and some of the equity spaces. So not to overwhelm people with meetings upon meetings, we do recognize the importance of the structure of this group and the objectives. And so we'll be meeting again in the 21st of March. No, the Equity Inclusion Work Group meets the 21st of March. So more on that to continue, but really great conversation. Leah, I think you are in those spaces as well. If you had any additional comments to make, yes, please do. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, it might help you, Christina, with a lens to know that comprehensive planning was not a state law until the 50s. So there was no structure for how and where people developed.
Well, the 1930 and 1938 Lawrence, City of Lawrence did have a plan, a city plan for how development went, especially for housing districts. They talked specifically about the West Hills district and just some planning and development that was a city plan and was gathered in a collection of folks who added to the comments of that planning, just like we are doing today. I can share that a really good report created by Holly Krebs that talks about segregation in Lawrence, what happened in Lawrence.
I'm familiar with it.
Yeah, so I'll share that with you, and then maybe there could be more clarity on what those plans look like. But yeah, you're right, 1930, 1948, and those weren't very far times ago. And so some of those really had some great articles, but I think would be great to continue to understand about where our community was not too long ago in that space of housing.
Okay, thank you, Christina.
You're welcome.
Mark, Phil, of course. All right, are there any other new business that any board member has? All right, seeing none, I am not going to read the calendar to y'all. Let you do that yourselves. And with that, we are adjourned.
Cool.
I owe you 4 minutes.
Yes, we'll never recover it.
We did the last meeting. We finished early.
That's sure we did.
So I have 4 minutes of grace.